woo. All right, so I think it's recording. I'm gonna hit slideshow and I think we're good to go. All right, if at any point you can't hear me or there seems like you can't see the slideshow, please just let me know. Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, so what is sensory processing? So, this is something that gets thrown out a lot. I think that sensory, it's a good thing, has become more understood and more recognized kind of in the mainstream world. And so, we're throwing out the word sensory a lot. What does sensory mean? What is sensory processing? So sensory processing is really, it's the way that our central nervous system takes in and registers information from our environment, and then we integrate it into our brain so that we can produce a response. So just a, kind of an example I think we can all relate to is, so when you feel a hot stove, your hand touches the hot stove, your brain takes in the information. Ooh, that's hot. I need to produce a response. I'm going to draw my hand away. Now, obviously, all of that happens in about hopefully 1 second, so you don't get too burned. Or for example, you walk outside and you can sense on your skin that it's cold outside. So you go back in and you grab a coat. So it's the way that we take in the sensory information in our environment and then how our brain really integrates it all so that we can respond appropriately, or sometimes in the case of kiddos or adults with sensory processing disorders, in a not so adaptive way. So that's kind of big picture what sensory processing is. So sensory processing difficulties is really, it's when we have difficulty processing and integrating that information. And then how do we respond? Do we respond appropriately for the situation or inappropriately for the situation? So this can kind of look a couple different ways. So it could be someone is, an individual is missing information, they're misinterpreting information in their environment, and then the responses that they produce are maybe not really matching the situation. So for example, when we talk about misinterpreting, maybe, a loud noise, it's for a lot of people, maybe doesn't come off as, even I would say painful. But for some of our kids, it's really, that's how they feel. That's how their brain registers that information. It is aversive and it's uncomfortable to their body. Now, some kids, they will eventually learn how to deal with that. And maybe their response will be a little bit more fitting for the situation. But when they're younger and they don't understand why this feels so uncomfortable, it's reasonable that they're going to cover their ears and they're going to cry, because to them, that sensory information feels really, really uncomfortable. So that's what happens when we look at sensory processing difficulties. So the way that they're taking it in is not matching what's kind of going on in the environment around them. And then that response is sometimes inappropriate or, doesn't quite match the situation. So what do our one other big picture piece of this is, I always say to parents, we all have our own sensory preferences and we all have our own kind of sensory quirks. So, I'm sure all of you guys can think of, I really don't like the feel of this kind of fabric on my skin. Like, I know for me, I can't wear certain kind of sweaters, or there's that scent that just drives you absolutely crazy. So we all have our own sensory, preferences or things that we maybe don't like. And the same in all of our children. Where I always say we kind of need to start looking at intervention or treatment, or is this really a difficulty, is when does it get in the way of function? So if it gets to the point where, you're not able to go somewhere because you don't like the way that certain scent smells. Like, let's say your coworker has a really, really, really strong perfume and you're like, I can't go to work because I know I'm going to smell that perfume. That's when we're starting to talk about disorders, or needing treatment, because it's getting in the way of your ability to function and participate in your daily life. So same with kids. I always give the example, my own son, he, gets very overwhelmed with loud noises, especially when he was little. So he would be a kiddo when it was loud. If it was unexpected, he would cover his ears and get upset. However, he was usually able to work through it and we could still go into that place or go somewhere. So yes, it was an area of difficulty for him, but it didn't tip the scales in terms of needing that treatment at that point, because it wasn't impeding his ability to function and participate in those daily activities. So that's kind of where I usually kind of explain to parents, that's when we really need to consider more intensive treatment or seeking out the help of an OT when it's starting to impede that participation. So what do these, sensory processing difficulties look like? And they very rarely look the same in all children. Every child is unique. And so we kind of say we have these profiles, but every kid is going to look a little bit different. So we all have our own different thresholds for detecting sensory input in our environment. So we all have that. We're going to use the example of a noise in the environment. So we all have a different threshold. So it's the exact same noise, same pitch, same volume. Every single one of us has a different threshold for kind of where our brain is detecting it and saying, oh, I hear a sound. And then we're not talking about hearing loss, but we're talking about actual auditory detecting. I hear an auditory sound in my environment. So we all have a different threshold for when our brain says, oh, I hear something auditory. I need to integrate this in my brain and produce a response. So some of us have a very high threshold. So we may need that input at a higher intensity than most people. Some of us have a low threshold. We kind of hear every noise in our environment, right? So some people, for example, someone with a high threshold, that you may feel like you need to call their name about 6 times before they respond to you, right? So you saying, Brendan, their brain is not really saying, hey, someone's talking to you. You need to listen to that and respond. So you may need to say it louder. You may need to say it a few times. So you need to give a higher intensity of input to really kind of tick their brain as saying, hey, I hear something. I need to respond to this. That lower threshold is that kid who, oh my gosh, I hear every noise in the environment. It's driving me crazy that you're whispering across the room. So we all have these different thresholds for detecting these stimuli in our environment. So a couple other examples of a high threshold is maybe a child who doesn't seem to notice when they bump into things. Or a low threshold is they're sensitive to smells. They can feel every tag on their shirts, things like that. So we all have these different thresholds, and it's different for each input. So someone may be really sensitive to smell, but not that sensitive to auditory processing. So I always really like to break each sense down when I'm looking at a student or a child and say, okay, let's look at how do they process sound? How do they process visual input? How do they process tactile input? And we can kind of look through, and based on their behaviors, we can usually figure out, do they have a high threshold for that input or a low threshold? So that's kind of the big picture of how we are detecting that input is really dependent on our own personal threshold neurologically. So our high threshold individuals, we would say, once again, these are the kids who need that really intense or repeated input to kind of get their brain going. We would say that they're hypo-responsive or a low registration. You may have heard this if you had an OT read a sensory profile results to you. And so when we have these kids who have that high threshold, we typically see them respond in one of 2 ways. So the first, and this is more common, is a sensory seeker. So they're a kid, because they need more sensory input than most to activate their system. They spend their whole day seeking to try and wake up their system to self-regulate. So, they're kind of like, I always say it's almost like they're kind of in like a fog or a bubble where, everything's a little bit duller to them. So they're like, okay, I need to counteract that by seeking to help wake up my body and wake up my sensory system, because I need things more intense than everybody else. So that's one way that kids respond, that seeking behavior. The other way is sedentary or low arousal. So these are the kiddos who are like, it takes a lot of input to wake up my body, and that is a whole lot of work, and I'm exhausted. So I'm just kind of going to stay here in my muted bubble, because it's exhausting trying to wake up my system day in and day out all day long. So, kind of the example that I give in this is, there's a day that you wake up and maybe your kids have been sick, given the way things are going lately. You're absolutely exhausted, and you kind of have 1 or 2 choices. You're like, all right, I got to get through this day. What am I going to do? You could either seek out that sensory input. All right, I'm going to get up. I'm going to go to the gym. I'm going to get coffee. I'm going to turn my music really loud to kind of help me wake up so I can get through my day. Or you're like, you know what? I can't today. I'm just going to go the other route, and I'm just going to kind of have a lazy day on the couch. I'm going to watch some TV and just kind of accept that this is the way my body is feeling today. So those are kind of the examples that I give, that, you can have kids with the same threshold, but they have 2 different responses, kind of based on, their own personal behavior patterns. So those are for our kiddos who are high thresholds. For our kiddos who are low thresholds, so the sensitive kids, they detect everything in their environment. We typically see two patterns of behavior. So the first is sensory sensitivity. So they may exhibit strong emotional or behavioral reactions to sensory input in their environment, especially if it's unexpected or unanticipated. So we've talked about, covering the ears, or, maybe they get that soft touch that they don't like. So their first instinct is to take a whack at whoever touched them nicely. So those are, kind of that sensory sensitive. They have those strong emotional or behavioral reactions to that input. And then the other is sensation avoiding. So these kiddos know, hey, if I go in that cafeteria, or I go in that Chuck E. Cheese birthday party you're trying to make me go to, there's going to be a whole lot of unexpected sensory information that's going to be really overwhelming for me. So I'm just not even going in there. So a lot of times, or we may see the kid who doesn't like their fingers getting messy. So every time it's time to go to the art table to do arts and crafts, they just refuse because they know they might get glue on their hands, or they know they might get the paint on their hands. So sometimes we see, kids with those just complete avoiding behaviors as well. Okay, any questions on any of that so far? I'm throwing a lot of jargon out there, but.
Yes. Can your kiddo have both?
Absolutely. And that's a perfect question. So kind of what I alluded to before, and this is actually perfect because I pulled up this next slide here. So we have, essentially everybody knows about the 5 senses, right? But really we have 7 senses, and all of those senses are actually processed in different parts of our spinal cord and our brain. And the reason why that's important is because the way that you process one type of input may be different from another. So we absolutely see kids who maybe are super sensitive to taste, that, they gag, on a new food or a texture, or super sensitive to tactile information. They don't like, messy textures, but they may love to seek out vestibular inputs. They love to run. So we can see kids who might seek a certain kind of input, but then are sensitive and overwhelmed by other inputs. So that is very, very common. And that is because the senses are all processed in different parts of the brain and different parts of our spinal cord. So you can have different thresholds for different senses based on everybody's kind of unique profile. Did that answer your question? Perfect. Okay, great. So talking about the sensory, so what kind of senses are there? So we all know our tactile, so that touch, visual, what we're seeing, auditory, what we're hearing, taste, smell. But then the other 2 are actually very, very important senses in our body, but they're not often talked about. And so the first is what we call proprioceptive input. And proprioceptive input is input that's given to our joints and our skin and our tendons that kind of help us orient to where our body is in space. So for example, if I am taking my hand and I'm pushing down, I'm getting input up through my hands, through my wrist joint, through my elbow joint. It kind of gives me a sense of where am I. So when I say that, when you're standing up, you get input from the floor up through your ankles, through your heels, through your knees. And that kind of tells me, where am I in space? You also get it from gravity coming the other way. So that's kind of how we get a sense of where we are. And so proprioceptive input is really that deep pressure touch to our body. So you'll hear a lot from OTs about deep pressure, and that's what we call proprioceptive input. The other is vestibular input, and vestibular input is really how we process movement in our environment, and it's actually through our inner ear. So our head position tells us a lot about where we are. It gives us movement, and our balance is all through vestibular input. So it's the centers in our ears that kind of tell us when we move, if we're somersaulting, we're getting a ton of vestibular input because our head is going upside down and we're spinning and our ears are moving. So vestibular input is that movement, spinning, balance, all through the inner ear. So those are 2 super important senses, as I'm sure in your kids you see. They either seek, or maybe are a little bit more aversive too. So we'll kind of get into what that looks like, more specifically, we're going to kind of go through each sense and what you kind of might see in your child. So the term modulation is really our body and our brain's ability to take in that sensory information and produce an appropriate response. And I don't like to use the word appropriate, like in saying that it's right or it's wrong, because, I always say like what these kids feel is real, and they're not choosing to be, a stinker, or they're not choosing, like they feel uncomfortable in their body. That is why. But when I'm saying appropriate, I'm meaning, is it appropriate for the setting that they're in? Or is it maybe matching the intensity of what is going on in their environments around them? So really what this means is it's our ability to pay attention to the really important and pertinent information and kind of ignore the unnecessary stuff. So most of us honestly just do this without thinking. Most of our sensory systems are pretty well regulated and pretty well integrated. So we're kind of able, without thinking, to kind of block out that noise, block out the movement behind us, pay attention to the speaker, do all these things. Our brain is just doing it constantly. For our students who are, maybe extra sensitive to one thing and having a hard time registering another, that's not so simple and it's not so automatic. So, if you're in a classroom, an example is, are you able to ignore the sound that heater is making? It's going clink, 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 and still be able to listen to the teacher or stay engaged in a conversation. For our kids who have really low thresholds for auditory, they may not be able to. So it may be really hard for them to pay attention in math if they hear the heater going all the time. Or it's being able to listen to the teacher, but not get distracted by the signs and the posters on the wall. We have a lot of our kids who love to seek out visual input. So whether it's staring at bright colors or toys or their fingers, and so sometimes it's really, really hard to tune out the visual input, or they're the kiddos who someone walks in the room and they have to turn around and see what's going on because it's really hard for them to ignore that visual input that's in their environment. So like you said, modulation is really being able to pay attention to what you need to and to be able to kind of block out everything else. Okay, so what does this look like in our kids? I suppose I should ask, any questions so far? Sorry, no. Anything based on that before we kind of get into each of the senses here? Okay. All right. So tactile input. So when we're going to kind of go through each sense and we're going to break it down by whether they're kind of that under processor or whether they're more of that low threshold and more hypersensitive. So for, tactile input, which is touch, our under processors. So for those sedentary low arousal kids, remember, those are the ones who are like, oh my gosh, it's just too much for me to kind of wake up my sensory system. So I'm going to kind of stay in this kind of muted, sensory experience. So they may not notice when you tap them on the shoulder. So you kind of go up to them and tap them and they don't even respond. They don't turn around. You kind of have to like give that higher intensity input to get them to feel that tactile input. They may bump into walls or other students and not even notice. They may not notice their face is messy. So they're eating and they've got stuff all over their face and they totally don't even feel it and are not aware of it. Their brain is not picking up that like, hey, I've got, pudding on my face. I should wipe it off. Like their brain is not even, is not thinking about that. So they kind of leave it there, and it's not because they don't care, but their brain is not registering that it is there. So for our sensory seekers, for our kids who are like, yeah, I don't really feel touch, so I'm going to seek it out as much as I can because I like to feel the, touch. They maybe those kids who are running their hands along the wall, they're touching everything around them. Maybe their siblings, maybe you, maybe, if you're wearing a soft fuzzy sweatshirt, they can't help but touch your clothes, things like that. They may seek out unusual or strong textured objects. So they may like how it feels like something really rough, like sandpaper. I'm not saying that kids are walking around looking for sandpaper, but maybe it's some sort of texture that you're like, why are you touching that? That probably hurts. But for them, they're like, oh, I feel this. I sense this. So they are like looking for that tactile input to wake up their system. So our kiddos on the other side who are hypersensitive, they're the ones who, may be distressed by, they feel every tag on their clothing. If you kind of you get a new fabric and you're like, oh, look at this great shirt. And they put it on and nope, it's off right away because it's super uncomfortable. Typically not liking getting their nails clipped, their hair cut, refusing to engage in activities or art projects, their hands get messy. Or like we kind of talked about, if they are actually lightly tapped, maybe their response is to kind of hit other people or push them away. Not because they're necessarily trying to be, aggressive, but hey, what you just did really made me feel uncomfortable physically. And so my first instinct is to make it go away. So I'm going to push. Now, obviously, we want to teach a different strategy to deal with that as kids get older and really learn about themselves. But when they're younger, especially, that first instinct is, I don't like that sensory input. I need it away from me. And so one other important piece about tactile information, and this is, just important to explain to parents and teachers and paras is, it's really important to note that light touch and soft touch is processed in a different area of our brain than deep pressure touch. So that might be why your child loves hugs and squeezes and all of that, but they can't stand that feeling of that light touch. So often as adults, we think like we do a nice gentle pat, or like we kind of give like a nice, pat on the hand. That kind of input for our students who are tactily sensitive is awful. It is very aversive to them. So I always explain to parents or teachers, if you have a child who is sensitive to touch, make sure that any tactile kind of contact that you have with them is more of a deep pressure. So if it is, you feel like they're upset and they bump their head or something and you want to go comfort them, you may think, oh, I'm going to just rub their back nicely. Well, that may make it worse. I would say go over and give a nice deep squeeze hug, or approach from the front. And instead of giving a light tap on the hand, just nice, even pressure, because that kind of input is processed differently than the light touch, because light touch is it can be very aversive to a lot of our kids, which is why they don't like the feeling of the haircut or the buzzer or the nail clippers, all of that. So that is, and then we always, I'll get into that later. I was going to say, we also talk about, so sometimes if we do need to do things like clipping nails where we know they're going to be touching their skin, you can apply that deep pressure first to help kind of desensitize the area. And then that can help kind of dampen that system. And then it's a little bit less aversive when they do then get the light touch for some of those grooming activities. So that's just like a small thing. We'll get into kind of strategies and stuff later. But just while we were kind of talking about the relationship between light touch and deep pressure, they are connected in that way. So any questions on touch or tactile input? Yeah. Okay, and just a little confession, if this makes any of you feel better, I still clip my 8-year-old's toenails while he is sleeping because I'm an OT and it's still a nightmare. So just, had to throw that confession out there because sometimes it's just really hard.
You see things change with that as well. Like, they may, like, I think my son, he used to hate the clippers on his, not the clippers, he still hates the clippers, but he gets it done now versus he was 5, but to clip his nails is no problem now where it used to be a big problem. So
absolutely. That's awesome. And that's exactly what, what sensory integration and sensory and, kind of therapy and OT is, where we work to help make whatever input that they're not quite processing correctly or efficiently less aversive. And we do it through lots of different means. But my guess is that your son has probably been in OT or you've done things over the years where his brain is not so fight or flight of, oh my gosh, this stimuli is really scary and really uncomfortable. I've now learned either my body has matured, my neurological system has matured because I've explored more textures, and my brain is now able to better process and respond to that. So yes, absolutely. And that's kind of the whole premise behind our sensory therapy is we start to slowly expose kids to stimuli that's normally very aversive, but we do it in a very thoughtful way. And we do it in a way, whether we're pairing it with something that's really safe to them or something that's very preferred to them, to help their body start to learn that like, this is okay. This is not so uncomfortable. So yes, absolutely. We do see change. And that makes me so happy that, he's good with haircuts now, or sorry, that the fingernails are better. Maybe one day my 8-year-old will, I'll come around, but for now he's a deep sleeper and it's just where I am. So, had to throw that confession out for all of you. So even us OTs still don't have all the answers with our own kids. Okay, so the next slide is visual input. So our under processors, so sedentary low arousal kiddos, so they're the ones who seem to kind of miss problems on a worksheet. Like you're looking at their homework and like, why did you miss the whole second half of this page? Did you not see this part? They may have trouble finding their items in their room or their desk. They may have something that we often see in reading is they may have trouble distinguishing between similar looking shapes or letters. So maybe they often confuse like letter E and letter F because they really have to be paying attention to that visual stimuli. And so if they're just quick glancing and they're kind of still in that kind of like low arousal state, they may not be looking closely at the visual differences and they may make kind of silly errors that they know academically, but visually, they just aren't quite processing those details as cleanly as we'd like. So our sensory seekers, these are friends who love the toys with the exciting and the bright lights, the spinny toys, whether it's taking cars and spinning wheels in front of their eyes, very common way to seek out visual input. Walking around and looking closely at objects or posters in the room. Your students, or it's not students, sorry, kids may kind of look out of the corner of their eye at things and hold toys up really closely to their eyes. So they're seeking that visual input, that really feels good for their brain and for their body. Our hypersensitive kids, they may be really distracted by the posters or signs in the classroom. So, as much as teachers, we love to put up these pretty signs and all these bright things, often for our kids who are sensitive, it's so overwhelming and it's really hard for them to filter everything out. So often, like in a classroom, if we have kids like that, we may say, put them at the front of the room to reduce the visual distractions around them. They may frequently get distracted by any movement going around. So once again, someone walks in the room and they have to look and see what's going on. Or they may complain about bright light. They may not like to go out when it's really sunny without sunglasses or fluorescent lighting, things like that. So those are kind of the ways that we may see sensory issues with the visual input. Okay. So auditory input, so the sounds that we hear in our environment. So our under processors, they may seem to, for that low arousal sedentary, they may seem to miss oral directions. So they may not hear when their name is called. You may say, hey, so-and-so, can you go get your shoes on? And you feel like you've told them about 3 times and it's still not quite triggering in their brain that, hey, I'm hearing an auditory direction. I need to go follow through on that. So often you may need to pair that with a multisensory approach of, I'm walking up to you so you can visually see that I'm talking to you. And I'm going to say, or maybe I walk up and I give you that tactile cue on your shoulder, deep pressure if they're sensitive to tactile, and say, hey, I need you to get your shoe on, because the auditory is not enough and they're not quite getting that right away. Our sensory seekers, so they may listen to music or the TV really loud and it drives you crazy, but they seem to like it. They may hum or make noises to themselves all day long. They may have difficulty modulating the volume of their voice. So they may just be really loud because they like getting that auditory input. Just the noises in their environment helps kind of wake up their body, because remember, these are our high threshold kids who feel like they're kind of in that muted bubble. So by having loud music and noises, it helps wake up their body. It's kind of like sometimes if you're extra tired, you may turn the music on to help you finish that paper or whatever it is you're doing. It helps kind of wake up your body. So I always think about it, that's how these kids feel all the time. So that's why they're seeking out that noise and that sound to help kind of regulate their attention levels. In terms of hypersensitive, so this, if there's an unexpected drill, or an unexpected noise, maybe you turn on the vacuum and you didn't give them a heads up, or the dreaded blender, those can definitely trigger our kids. They may be anxious in a loud environment. So like going to an assembly or a large group activity, they may just flat out refuse to go in because they know, there could be unexpected cheering and all those sorts of things. They may cover their ears in a seemingly like, you're like, I don't think it's too loud in there, but they're covering their ears. Or they may try and avoid or escape activities with music or lots of talking. So maybe you tried to kind of bring them to a mom and tot music class when they were 2 and it was miserable because they didn't want to go in because, you know, a bunch of 2-year-olds playing cymbals is probably awful for their sensory system. And you may not you're like, why don't they like this? Well, it's probably very physically uncomfortable for them to kind of hear some of those sounds. So any questions about auditory or visual? No? Okay, we'll move on. All right, so taste and smell. So our under processors, they may seem to not notice strong smells. They may not really have strong food preferences. They kind of are ambivalent to food choices. They're not really tasting, you know, things very much. So for them, they're kind of like, I'll eat whatever you give me. You know, I'm not really sensing all that much. In terms of our seekers, though, they may be our students who are mouthing or licking non-food objects. They're constantly chewing their shirt, toys, pencils. They may like to smell everything. We have a lot of students who just want to smell everything. They really like food with strong textures and tastes and spicy because once again, they're like, I don't really taste much. So I want those, you know, flaming hot Cheetos because those are, you know, waking up my taste system more than whatever, you know, food that you're trying to give me, you know, probably like the healthy stuff. They're like, nope, I need the stuff with all of the taste. Now our hypersensitive kids, these are our friends who, you know, you may go into a restaurant and they immediately like turn around because it's like the smells. They may gag if, you know, they kind of smell a strong food around them or a strong smell, you know, if somebody's wearing a strong perfume. They may have a limited diet and really prefer those bland foods, maybe goldfish, Cheerios. This may sound familiar. Really liking what we call the beige diet, we say. So, you know, kind of carbs, you know, because those textures are pretty predictable and the smells are pretty predictable. And so, like you said, we may see kids, you know, gagging and showing a strong emotional reaction to the food being presented. And just kind of you know, kind of an extra comment on the eating piece. You know, this one is a really tricky one. It is not as simple as like, you know, you can put a behavior system in place or you can try, you know, food and taste and that the textures in the mouth can be really, really tricky. And so if you do have a child who is very sensitive and you notice they gag, they're very emotional about certain tastes and textures with food, I do highly recommend working with an OT or a speech pathologist who really kind of specializes in feeding or this piece, because kids can get very strong emotional reactions to these sorts of things. And if we don't necessarily approach it in the right way, it often can kind of backfire. And then sometimes our kids become more picky and more restrictive about their food. And so in some ways, you know, a lot of our other senses, we can still kind of get by this way, but obviously kids need to eat and nutrition is important. So, you know, this is one that we just want to be extra careful about in the way that we're approaching it, because obviously we need our kids to, you know, we want them to eat more than 1 or 2 foods. But it's not as simple. And so it's always okay if you're feeling like you're really struggling in this area to reach out and ask for a little bit more help on this one, because, oh, sorry, my throat's getting dry. So please, you know, always feel free to reach out for extra help on that one, because it's a trickier situation than most. Okay. So vestibular input. So remember we talked about vestibular input is that movement, and it's movement input that we process through our inner ear. It's most often detected through changes in head position. So once we change our head position, our brain says, oh, we're moving, and we're moving in a different way than I was before. So our under processors, so our low arousal, our kiddos who kind of stay in this under responsive state. They may be kiddos who are kind of slumping or leaning on their chair or desk. They maybe rarely engage in active play because it's not that rewarding for them. They're not getting that, like the movement. They need so much input to kind of wake up their system. They're like, I got to work really, really hard. I got to spin twice as fast. I got to run twice as fast to get that reward and that registration in my brain. So I'm just going to stay here. I'm going to sit on the bench at recess, or, you know, I don't really want to play soccer like you would like me to. Now our sensory seekers, this is a super common one, is our kids who are just constantly moving. They're moving around the room. They love spinning. They love swinging. They're typically rocking in their chair on the floor. So often a lot of our kids, actually kind of choose this sensory seeking option for the vestibular input, which is why often if your child does get OT services for difficulties with this, they maybe likely are doing things on a swing, right? So the OT has them in a very kind of prescriptive routine of like, I'm putting them in the swing and I'm giving them that really intensive movement input to help them regulate, because it's far more helpful if they're getting that spinning input in a more controlled way under kind of the supervision of an OT versus during circle time, if they're in the middle of the classroom, just spinning, or in the middle of your living room or while you're trying to eat dinner and they're just spinning or jumping and all those sorts of things. So finding ways that we can give kids this movement and vestibular input that's maybe more appropriate or helpful in the situation. Now, our hypersensitive kids to vestibular input, these are, kiddos who maybe get motion sick on the car or the bus. They maybe dislike slides or swings. They maybe don't like their feet off of the ground. Like I said, we talked about more of those sedentary activities because they're afraid if I run and spin too much, I might start to kind of feel yucky and feel dizzy. So I just am going to go ahead and stay here. They may avoid bikes or trikes, things like that. Yeah, did somebody have a question or just somebody just get on mute? Yeah. Okay, I didn't know if someone had a question. All right. So that is motion and vestibular input. Anybody have a question on vestibular input?
Actually, I do.
Yeah, sure.
I'm just trying to understand. My son actually exhibits, symptoms that are consistent with both columns here, right? So,
Yes.
I'm sorry. Could you go back a slide?
Yes, I was actually just thinking that. I'm like, I want to try and go back. What did I do here? I hit my hold on, sorry. Oh, now. Okay, there we go.
Yeah. So,
Okay.
so I mean, he gets sick in the car or bus, right? But he likes the other things that are, he likes slides and swings and and on the flip side of it, he's a sensory seeker and but he's unable to engage in play activities. So I'm trying to understand, how do you define or design strategies for addressing that when they seem to be exhibiting contradictory symptoms?
Yes, absolutely. I think what's important with vestibular input looking at is, so when he's on something, like when he's moving around the room or he's spinning or he's choosing to go on a slide or swing, he has a little bit more control over the pace and the intensity of it. So he's able to kind of do the things that make his body feel better and kind of, woken up. However, it's not going to push him to the point of feeling sick or nauseous. Whereas something like the car or the bus, he doesn't really have control over the speed or how bumpy it is or things like that. So he may be a kiddo who absolutely is seeking it, but we, like you said, we all have this kind of threshold for what we like. And then maybe it gets to the point where it's too much. And so that might be what's happening with your son, where he really likes movement and spinning and all these things, but only to a certain extent. And then it's too much for his body and he may get, motion sick or car sick, things like that. So does that make sense or help a little bit?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah, absolutely. So, it's kind of nice that obviously your son has figured out that, oh, I really like this, kind of movement and sensation for myself. But he knows when to stop. But like you said, unfortunately, with things like the car or the bus, or, maybe he's on a swing that somebody's pushing, and if he's not able to express himself to say stop or I don't feel good, he may be likely to get sick. Or if he's on something that's, at the playground is spinning and he's going and he wants to stop, but if he's not able to communicate that, then he might get, sick or something like that. So, there is, it's like kids like it at a certain point is regulating, but then sometimes it's just a little bit pushed too much, if that makes sense. Okay. All right. So proprioceptive input. So that deep pressure input that we talked about. So for our underprocessors, these kiddos kind of appear to be clumsy. They don't always know where their body is in space. So remember, we talked about proprioceptive input really gives us a sense of where is my body in space. So if a kid has a really high threshold, meaning their brain is not really detecting. So like when that feeling coming up through the floor, through their heel, up through their legs, up to their knee. If they're only sensing maybe about half of what other people are, they're just not quite sure of like, where am I? So they maybe are kind of like, we use the term lovingly, and I refer to myself as all the time, like a bull in a china shop, right? So they're kind of like moving through their environment, but they're not always quite sure where they are, and they're bumping into things and the wall and other people because they're just not quite sure where they are in space. They maybe lean on objects or furniture. They may have low muscle tone and be W sitting. They may have trouble using kind of the correct amount of force. So maybe they're like you're asking them to open something and they're like just like lightly pulling, and you're like, you got to pull a little bit more, because they're not quite sure how much pressure to put. Because if you think about it, when we're trying to open something, we're really relying on that feedback that we get through our fingers of how much force do I need to use to open this small container. So if our kids' senses are kind of blunted, it's really hard for them to figure out, do I pull and they pull and it like flies everywhere? Or I'm like not even getting close to using enough pressure. So once again, we're really relying on all that input that we get through our joints and fingers to figure out how much pressure to use. So if our kids are under responsive, then then they're more likely to not always know how to kind of use the right amount of force. They may not use enough force when writing. So maybe they write super light and you're like, you got to press harder, because once again, they're not getting that input to their hands. So our sensory seekers, because they're not getting that input, they're like, all right, I got to find a way to get that deep pressure input to my joints and to my muscles. So they are running, they're hopping, they're jumping on the stairs. They love to crash. They love to wrestle. They're walking on their toes. Toe walking is a huge, huge way to get proprioceptive input. So if you think about it, and I know a lot of you guys have your camera off, so feel free, if you want, go up on your toes and you will see you get a ton of input, because now if you think about all of your body weight is now going basically to the balls of your feet. So it's a pretty intensive sensory sensation in terms of proprioceptive input. So a lot of our kids who are toe walkers are actually seeking that kind of deep pressure input, because they get a lot up. Instead of it being dispersed throughout your entire foot, it's now on just the balls of your feet. And it kind of gives a more intensive sensation. And so in terms of being hypersensitive, this is one of those things where proprioceptive input is actually almost always regulating to the nervous system. So there's very few children who actually don't like deep pressure, because it's the same kind of concept of why we swaddle babies. That deep pressure hug is very, very regulating to our nervous system. So it's why maybe like, if you're anxious or you're having a hard day, you want to just wrap up in pillows or blankets, or you might really like a deep hug or kind of like a snuggle from somebody, because that kind of deep pressure input is very regulating to our body. It's why, a lot of people are using weighted blankets, adults now, you can buy them on Amazon, because a lot of us find that deep pressure input is very calming to our nervous system. So I do have parents who say, but my kid doesn't like hugs. What we often find when kids don't like deep pressure input, it's not often that they don't like the actual sensation. What they often don't like is that they don't like input that they're not in control of. So for example, they may not like a hug if they feel like they are not in control. Like, so if somebody comes up and gives them a hug and they weren't ready for it, they may not like that feeling. So it's not necessarily the hug, it's the fact that that was kind of done to me and I wasn't ready for it and I wasn't in control of it. Same thing with some of our kids who like deep pressure, but they don't like weighted vests. They don't like pressure vests. A lot of our kids don't like it because they feel like they're not in control of it. So for those kids, I often will recommend a weighted lap pad, because they are in control of it. They can choose where to put it on, when to take it off. Things like that. So often it's pretty rare that people find deep pressure input to be sensory unpleasant, but often it's the way that it's presented or the way that it's kind of happening that kids can be kind of hesitant or may seem to not like. So most of our kids are going to fall under that under processor category and whether they're going to seek it out, or they just seem like they just are not really aware of where their body is. And I would say that the majority of kids with sensory difficulties are going to show some, and I'm sure a lot of you would agree, are going to show a few of these things in one of these categories. So it's pretty common for kind of to have some of this, challenges in this area with processing proprioceptive or deep pressure input. Any questions on that one? I know proprioceptive is kind of a big one. No? All right, perfect. Okay, so how does this tie into behavior? So the way that we, always like common question and things that come up is it sensory or is it behavior? Is it sensory or is it behavior? And unfortunately, it's not always cut and dry and it's not always super clear. However, when we're looking at problematic or different behaviors, if you know that your child does have sensory difficulties, it's always very, very important to really consider the sensory demands around that problematic behavior. So for example, if you're almost always having behaviors around a specific time of day or a certain activity, we really want to consider the environment and the factors that might not be so obvious to us because our sensory systems are well regulated and we may not even really be noticing or some of those things. So for example, if a child is under responsive to auditory stimuli, we've talked about what looks like is they often are not hearing those verbal directions. So you may be losing your mind, like they don't follow directions. I asked them to do things 5 times and they're choosing not to listen, or they're taking forever to get out the door. I've asked 5 times, so someone may, if you're not aware that they may be under responsive to auditory, you may think that they're choosing to not listen to you. But really it might be actually their brain is just not registering in the same way that maybe your other child does, or maybe that you do. Or if a child is sensitive to smells at lunchtime and that puts them on edge. So then, they're kind of already in the cafeteria and they're like, oh, it smells so bad. I can smell everybody's food. So they're kind of on edge. And then they get bumped into by a kid by accident and they kind of go into sensory overload and melt down. And you're kind of like, wait, what happened there? Well, let's consider the environment. So if this kid is having a lot of meltdowns in the cafeteria, well, let's look at the sensory kind of demands that are there. Is there anything that we can do to kind of help lessen some of that so that they do get bumped into or they drop their peaches or whatever, it doesn't send them into a total meltdown because they were already so heightened because of the sensory demands. The other one is like if a child is under responsive and decreased body awareness, so they're constantly seeking out movement and deep pressure because they're trying to stay engaged. So we're like, oh my gosh, they will not sit. I take them to library story time and they will not sit. They're just constantly moving and crashing and crawling all over me and they're just not listening. Well, maybe they're sitting in that library story time and nothing's really coming in because they're so under responsive. So they're like, I know in order to like pay attention, I got to do these things to help kind of wake my body up. But obviously in that situation, that's not going to be the best way to get it because it's going to be disruptive to other people. And frankly, they're not really going to be listening if they're climbing all over you and running and jumping. So kind of, the way that we all look at this is then, so what can we do to help give our kids this input in a way that still allows them to participate effectively in their environment? So we'll kind of get into that. So that's, when we look into, is it sensory, is it behavior, often it's both. And often sometimes, kids get stuck in patterns and they get stuck in cycles and maybe something started as sensory and then it kind of morphed into behavior. And so it's just important that when we're trying to problem solve or come up with strategies to help our kids that we're kind of looking at it from a bigger lens. And that's where you can always call in your OT, whether you have a school OT or a private OT or whatever, to kind of say, hey, do you think there's something that I'm missing that could be actually sensory based or is sensory kind of a part of this and I just didn't think about it? So what we often are trying to do is teaching our kids to identify, how am I feeling? And, because the more that we can try and teach them that, I'm feeling this way because of, it's too loud in here. It's too, we want to teach our kids and give them the capacity to say, my body feels this way because of X, Y, and Z. And then what can I do about it? So we often go with there's a program called the Zones of Regulation. It's not a great fit for every kid. Some kids really like it. Some kids, it can be hard for them to kind of really grasp the concept of, but if it's something you're interested in, you can always kind of look more into it. But it's really just teaching our kids, and there's different colors, that no zone is bad, because this is kind of what we talked about. We want to be careful, especially if our kids are responding to different sensory stimuli. They're not always trying to have problematic behaviors. It's just how they feel in their body. So, no zone is bad. It's just, what do we do about it? So it's like what we talked about, where, if a kid gets bumped into accidentally, or a teacher taps the shoulder nicely, it's okay for the kid to figure out, oh, yeah, that's right, I don't like that. But my response can't be, I'm going to hit someone, or I'm going to push someone. It's got to be, whoop, I'm going to take a deep breath, or I'm going to ask them to walk away, or I'm going to hold up, I'm going to take my device and I'm going to say, please stop. So, it's really teaching them no zone is bad. It's, this is how I'm feeling. Does it match the situation? And what can I do about it if I need to change? So for example, it's okay to be silly and loud at recess, the yellow zone, but we don't really want to be doing that in class. Or it's expected you would be sad if your pet died, right? So like those are okay feelings, but we have to kind of have appropriate responses, or we need to have a toolbox to help kind of deal with those unpleasant feelings. So this is just an example. And if this is something you're hearing, you're like, oh, this might be a good fit for my child, or you've heard your kid's teacher talk about it, it's certainly something that you can Google. It's on the internet, they have a lot of visuals. You can help your child identify, yep, it seems like you're feeling frustrated. It seems like you're feeling in the yellow zone. I can tell that your body you're squeezing your hands, and I could tell that you're getting kind of frustrated or agitated. It seems like you're in the yellow zone. Or if your student, primarily communicates through visuals, you can have visuals and you can be pointing, it seems like you're in the yellow zone, to kind of communicate and help give them the language to show, how they're feeling. Okay, so now we're just going to talk about, okay, so we have all these things. So like, what are some things that we can do to help our kids? Because, obviously it's exhausting and it's challenging, when, daily tasks can feel really, really overwhelming for our kids. And as a parent, that's exhausting for you too. If every time you're trying to clip their nails, it ends in tears and hitting and crying, that's really hard on you guys as parents. And so there's different strategies that we can use. So the strategies that I'm kind of giving are going to be a little bit more general, just kind of based on what we've talked about. But if you have a really specific situation that you're feeling like, I'd really like to problem solve this with my child's OT, please feel free to reach out, because we can give more kind of tailored suggestions based on what we know about your child. So in general, for our kiddos who we've talked about, who are that under responsive, kind of low arousal, kind of staying in that muted bubble, and we need to kind of do things to help wake up their sensory system. But we want to do it in a way that is appropriate to the situation, because if we don't find a way to give it to the kid, either they're going to find it their own by seeking it out sensory wise, or they're kind of going to stay in their own world and not really be engaged in the environment. So the number one thing is movement. So getting that body moving is really going to wake up that sensory system. So it can be jumping on a trampoline, animal walks. So if you're not sure what an animal walk is, things like bear crawls, crab walking, frog jumps, anytime that we can kind of pair multiple sensory inputs. So if you're doing an animal walk, you're not only getting the vestibular input, the movement, you're also getting the deep pressure, because if you think about it, if you're bear walking, you're getting a ton of input up through your joints. So you're getting that deep pressure. Or if you're hopping like a frog, you're getting lots of deep pressure, as well as that movement and changing in head position. Spinning. So, it could be, if it's at your home, it could be in an office chair. It could be one of those sit and spins that you buy. And the only thing that I always say about spinning, and I always caution, is if your child has a seizure disorder, I do not recommend any kind of spinning unless you've talked to your pediatrician or your doctor about what is safe, because spinning can trigger seizure activities in our kids with seizures. So that's just my, number one, make sure that you know what is safe for your kid in that way. But then also knowing that some of our kids are very sensitive to spinning input. So you don't want to get your kid in an office chair and just start firing them around in circles, because that may totally backfire in terms of, oh my gosh, now I'm like a little bit nauseous, or I wasn't expecting that. So I always say start really slow, or let your child control the pace. So maybe they move it around with their feet at first, so they're kind of in control of the pace and the movement. And just always monitor their response. So if your child is not able to verbally tell you, I don't like this, or stop, look for signs of, you know, in their eyes, if all of a sudden their eyes are kind of looking really wide and alert, but not in a good way, or, you know, maybe they're starting to, you know, kind of tense up, then I would always stop or slow down, because we don't want to kind of, it's like anything, if you get motion sick, nobody likes to be kind of feeling like you're not in control of any kind of spinning motion. But some kids love it, and they love it if you put them in and, you know, kind of spin them around, and it's a really alerting kind of input. Being upside down is another great way to get input. So a lot of times we're like, well, how do you like just get your kid upside down? Do I hold them? No. You can kind of put them on the couch, and you can have their feet up on the couch, and maybe their favorite book is on the ground and they're on their elbows, kind of like that. And their head is upside down, so they're kind of distracted and looking at a book, but they're getting some nice input. You don't want to leave them like that for too long if all the blood rushes to their head, but just kind of, you know, having that way. Doing somersaults is another way of kind of being upside down, or it could be just like if they're, you know, kind of hanging off the couch a little bit upside down, just for a few seconds, kind of helps give a nice change in head position. A scooter board is another good one. Scooter boards are nice because they can also kind of push themselves. That gives some more deep pressure input as well. And bouncing on a therapy ball, if you have an exercise ball, just kind of bouncing, you know, holding on to them, being behind them so they don't fly off or fly forward, but kind of bouncing them up and down in a linear motion is another way to kind of give some nice alerting input. A glider or a rocker chair, you know, even if just you're reading books, pairing that with, I'm in my glider, I'm in a rocking chair, because I'm giving some nice linear, really organizing movement input. Crunchy snacks is another one. If you feel like you have a kid who, you know, really has a hard time paying attention during something, you know, send them, you know, extra crunchy pretzels or whatever, because that's another way to get a lot of nice input through the jaw. Or like you said, if your kid likes, you know, tolerates strong flavors, send them with snacks or things that have stronger flavors to kind of help wake up their sensory system. We also I sometimes recommend those water bottles that have a sport top or a chewy spout, because they can they have to suck or they can chew. And it's more input to the mouth, which can also be alerting. And especially if they're in class, that's another way to kind of give them a little bit of input. Music is another one. And I think, you know, technology is so great now, where you can have wireless headphones or earbuds, you know, hooked up to something. So if you feel like your kid just needs a little, you know, put on some like upbeat music, your child might use something called like quick shifts at school. That's another thing that kind of has different alerting sounds, and you know, might be something that, you know, if you're interested in looking into, you know, some of that kind of upbeat and alerting music and rhythms can be really organizing for the brain. And then fidgets. So that's another one, you know, they're very popular right now too. All the different popper balls and squeeze balls and everything is another way that you can kind of, if you're at library story time or whatever it is, and you just want to give them something to squeeze or hold on to, or you're in the waiting room at the doctor's office, you know, always be aware, of course, fidgets sometimes can be chucked. So I always, you know, am thoughtful about the fidgets that, you know, we try out and given the setting, but we try to always tell our kids, you know, our fidgets stay in our lap, they stay in our hands, and if they don't, they go bye-bye, and kind of setting that expectation early. However, I do always say that, you know, we want to give our kids and expose our kids to new and novel supports in a place where they can be successful. So, you know, if you're going to church or somewhere quiet, or, you know, just some place where it's like really important that they're very quiet, don't give them a really new, exciting fidget for the first time in that setting, because guess what? They're a kid. They're going to be super excited, and they're going to be waving it around in the air, and they're going to be trying like all the different features of it. And you're going to be like, this is terrible. So give it to them first in a very safe and familiar setting, so they can kind of get that excitement out in a place where the stakes are very low. So, you know, you just want to be careful with some of those more like novel and exciting things you're giving for the first time. Think about, okay, yeah, they're a kid. They're going to be super excited about all the features of it. So try it out in a little bit of a safer setting, so that by the time you want to use it, you know, in the library or whatever, it's not going to be, you know, the excitement will have worn off a little bit and they might be using the features more appropriately. Okay, any questions about sensory supports to kind of increase? We're going to get to more of the calming stuff, which is usually kind of what parents are more looking for, but there's certainly, you know, we definitely use these things as well. So any other questions about kind of revving our sensory systems up? Okay. All right, this list is a little longer, as you guys can see. And the point is you guys will have access to this, so you can always go back and look and reference it. So our sensory supports for calming or organizing. So this is really, you know, just when our kids are dysregulated, and we use the term dysregulated in the fact that like just their sensory system has gone haywire, whether something is too loud, something is too busy, and I'm just overstimulated, I'm overwhelmed, and I just can't process what's going on around me. So I need something to kind of like re-regulate my body and my brain. So what are some things that we can do for our kids when they're in this moment? So first and foremost is linear movement. So we talked about movement on the other slide. So kind of as a rule of thumb, any kind of spinning and rotation is very alerting, and anything linear is very calming. So it's just like babies, when we rock them in the rocking chair, or even there's plenty of times I'm stressed as an adult and I'm rocking in my chair. You know, we kind of do these things naturally because our body recognizes that, you know, that linear input is very organizing to our brain. So a rocking chair, just a regular playground, linear swing, headphones or calming music. So, you know, if you know your kid has a really hard time at, let's say you're going to a busy birthday party and you're like, oh my gosh, it's always a disaster when we walk in. They're so overstimulated. It's just so stressful. You know, maybe having them come in with their favorite calming songs playing to kind of help introduce them to that setting. So like you said, the nice thing is those Bluetooth headphones are so much easier. So you can maybe have something playing through your phone to the headphones to kind of help them when they're going into a setting where it's too much, or like, hey, I know it's gonna be really loud, so let's kind of have things ready to go. Play-Doh, kinetic sand, sensory bins, popping bubble wrap. Now, obviously, if your kid is tactily sensitive, they may not find a tactile bin so calming. So this is more for some of our sensory seekers who actually really find squishing Play-Doh, kind of picking up the sand and watching it fall. It can actually be really calming and regulating for our kids. So that's another thing that you can kind of have, you know, ready to go. If you're going somewhere, you know, maybe the first couple of minutes is you can sit and play with your Play-Doh, listen to your headphones to kind of get acclimated to the environment. We talked about animal walks and wheelbarrow walks. Once again, that's just a lot of deep pressure. The rule of thumb here is any way you can get deep pressure involved in any of this, it's so good for the nervous system. So those wheelbarrow walks, animal walks are really, really good for that. Jumping or crashing into a pillow or blanket pit. We do this at my house a lot, especially in January when my kids are just off the wall seeking. We just like take a bunch of comforters and couch cushions and like just make a giant pit, and they can just jump and crash into the pit. And then often so I kind of let them go wild and just jump, jump, jump. But then, all right, now we got to kind of bring it down. So then maybe let's like cover you in the pillows and then we'll read a book or we'll listen to music, or if they watch a show before bed or whatever it is, allowing those pillows and blankets give a lot of really nice deep pressure kind of all over. So that's another way that you can kind of start with get the movement out, get the movement out, get the movement out. But okay, now let's kind of bring it back down. A body sock or a weighted blanket. So, you know, these are kind of things that, you know, people are really finding. It used to be you really could only kind of get this stuff if your kid got OT and they ordered it for you from a special catalog. But the reality is it's now really all out there on Amazon. And I think that's honestly a good thing and a bad thing. It's a good thing because it's more accessible for our families. And it's like, hey, this is what I need. It's easy for me to order. I don't have to go through. However, it does, you know, it makes me as an OT a little nervous sometimes because I want to make sure that parents are selecting the right, you know, and appropriate things. So that's why I put on there. So like a weighted blanket, make sure it should be less than 10% of their body weight. And I don't recommend using it for sleeping unless you're consulting with an OT, especially it just always kind of makes me nervous. We want to make sure your child has the correct motor skills to take something off. So I definitely do not recommend a weighted blanket for sleep. unless you're working with, you know, an outpatient therapist or whatever it is to kind of work on that. So like you said, all these things are just so out there and available now. So I always like to caution parents, when you are buying things on your own, if you're ever like, you know what, I want to make sure I'm getting the right size, I'm getting the right weight, or I'm following the right protocols, anything weighted, I always do recommend reaching out to an OT for guidance, because you just want to make sure that, you know, you're using the right size or kind of the right timing for some of these things. So that's kind of my, you know, my spiel about safety here. So we're always here as a resource for you to help figure out what's a good match for your kid. And body socks, if you haven't seen them, those are those like Lycra, they're kind of like a square and there's a hole in it and the kid can climb in. Once again, we have one in my house. You can climb on in and they can stretch and push against the Lycra, and it gives a lot of like really nice, it's kind of their own space. I just also tell kids, don't let them run in it, because if they slip and fall, sometimes they can't like catch themselves. So that's a battle in my house. Now you can't run in it. You just got to kind of roll around on the ground in it. As far as yoga cards, those are so easy to find online now. Any event, you know, spring or winter yoga cards, there's so many themes out there now that people have put out there. If you want an activity with your kid, yoga is so good because it provides that deep pressure input. So if you think about it, every position is really giving a lot of deep pressure input through the joints. So that's a great way that you can get kind of a calming activity. Heavy work, if you get OT, you've probably heard the term heavy work over the years. That's just one thing. It's just basically any activity where they're really using your muscles and getting deep pressure. So things like pushing and pulling and carrying heavy things is all what we say heavy work, because you're using your muscles, you're using your joints. So that's where you can kind of use your kids to help you with chores. So like, I'm going to help you, you know, unbreakable groceries, bring in the heavy grocery bags. Can you use your muscles and help me with that? Can you help me put the wet laundry in the dryer? Or, you know, giving them like at school, we'll often say, hey, will you go bring this ream of paper to this teacher? They're out of paper. But really, we're just trying to give them a job where it's like, all right, you're holding something heavy because it's good for the muscles and really organizing for the system. Carrying stacks or bags of book. Hey, you're going to bring the library books in from the car. They're all in a bag. Just little things that any way that you can find throughout your day to kind of get that input to your kid is really helpful. Tug of war games, making obstacle courses. So crawling over the pillows, crawling under through tunnels, because all of that, once again, is really giving that input to the joints and muscles. And pulling a heavy wagon is another one. So even if you're like going for a walk around the neighborhood, not now, it's not that great out, but when it's warm, hey, can you pull the wagon for me and just put like some heavy stuff in there? Gives some nice input as well. Rolling up tightly in a blanket. So we'll say, hey, like we're going to make, you're going to be a hot dog. We're going to roll you up and roll them in a blanket. You can put pillows on top of them. The only thing I always say is just make sure you're never pushing on the front of your child. So if you're kind of covering them in pillows and stuff, just try not to put, you don't want to be like pushing and putting pressure on their tummy. There's a lot of important organs in there. But if you're kind of rolling them up and putting pillows on their back, that's a lot of really nice deep pressure input. Playground activities, swinging, hanging. If you think about it, hanging is really a lot of good input to the joints, to your shoulders and your arms. So even just hanging from the monkey bars is a really nice deep pressure activity. Swinging on the swing is that linear vestibular input. Climbing, sliding is all really nice, sensory calming input. When we also look at drinking liquids, like through a straw, once again, we talked about like some of these you'll notice can kind of be both alerting and calming, because it's kind of stuff that gives deep pressure. And we say deep pressure can really help with pretty much everything. So once again, the Sport Top or the Chewy Straw, because they can kind of get a little bit of extra input to their mouth. We do anything blowing, because blowing forces kids to take deep breaths. So if we do blowing games like bubbles, think about blowing bubbles, it forces them to take deep breaths, which is very calming and organizing. You can have them have like a cotton ball or a ping pong ball on the ground and have them take a straw and try and blow it across the room. That also kind of forces them to take deep breaths, which can be calming and regulating. Using a spray bottle in the bathtub or water the flowers or water fight, because it's nice kind of squeezing to the hands. let's see, placing a heavy item. So we've talked about like on their lap. So in the schools, we often use weighted lap pads, but if you don't have a weighted lap pad at home, whether it's like a phone book or a heavy blanket, something on their lap just kind of gives that calming deep pressure input. We talked about lying on the floor, propped up on your elbows. That gives a lot of, if you think about it, deep pressure input through the whole front of your body. It's going through your elbows and your shoulders, as well as kind of uniform pressure to the front of your body. So having kids, I cannot stress enough. It's like tummy time, right? You're like, oh, I thought I was past tummy time in life. But having kids on their stomach is good for actually so many reasons, even as they get older, just for their strength and posture and balance and their vision system, all of that. So when you're reading books or doing puzzles, if you can encourage your kid to be on their stomach and on their elbows, that's really good for a lot of different ways. And then just, deep pressure massages, arm squeezes. I'm sure a lot of your kids like to have their hands squeezed or their arms kind of squeezed. That's another way, and just those deep hugs and snuggles, right? And if your kid is kind of resistant, once again, just taking their lead, and sometimes they just need to be in control of it. So, recognizing that like the hug may be really helpful, but not if you're just kind of surprising them with it, letting them kind of be in control of that input. And then kind of just the last piece in this is, we talked a little bit about this, but so if your child needs movement, and we often are like, oh my gosh, we really need to get this energy out. Like you're just got to get this energy out. So it's okay to let them run, like you said, run, jump, crash, do all those things to get their energy out. But it's really important that we often help them then bring themselves back down. So we often will have schools say, well, man, they come in from recess, they should be calm now. They got to run around for 30 minutes. Like, why aren't they calm? Well, they may be just actually kind of bouncing off the wall because they were just getting a ton of input, but it wasn't necessarily regulating. So often that's why a lot of teachers will actually, when kids come back from recess, they'll kind of have some sort of calming activity to bring everybody back down, because, movement in and of itself, yes, it helps get their energy out to some extent, but it may not be that calming, organizing input that they actually really need. So, if hey, I need to let my kid run around for 10 minutes, maybe let them run around for 7. And then that last 3 minutes is, okay, now let's do some yoga poses. Now let's do some deep breaths. Now let's do some hugs or squeezes to kind of bring some of our, sensory systems back down. Okay, so that. I just got a text from another person in the other room who can't get back in. So sorry. I just want to make sure to get her in. Let's see if I can text Tiffany on that one. Maria got kicked out of the room. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so that is the sensory supports for calming and organizing. Okay, and I think that's actually it. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen here. Okay. So any questions? I know that's all a lot to kind of throw out there. Any questions, any thoughts, anything before we wrap up? I know it's almost 7, but I'm happy to stay on and answer any questions or anything. All right, awesome. Well, thank you guys so much for coming tonight. I really, really appreciate it. Like you said, please reach out to your child's OT at their school if you have any kind of, if now that you kind of sat and you thought all through this and you're like, okay, either A, I'm way more confused now because there's so much to think about. Can you help me sort all this out now and kind of thinking about it with my kid? Or you can always reach out to me. I'm happy to chat with any parents through any of this that you've kind of listened to. So please, email me at any time. I'll put I don't know if I have this chat in here. Yeah. Okay. I'll put my email in here, but you can always find it on the district website. But yeah, please feel free to reach out if you have any follow-up questions, or reach out to your OT, and we are, happy to help and walk you through it, because it's a lot. And it can be kind of confusing, and it's a long process. So we're all here for you, and we just appreciate you guys coming tonight. All right, thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank
you're welcome.